All right, hey everyone, how's it going? Oh yeah, so some people, some folks still filtering in, but that's fine. We can just get rolling as they come in. So I dropped the link to the community call notes for today in the chats. We don't have to stay on agenda. This is just a suggested thing, but if you do want something covered, please just toss it in there. Just I believe anybody can hit the edit button. If not, drop in a message down below or bring it up during the call. We have an hour and I feel like a lot to get through. So I'm just going to dive right in. But actually, before I do that, is there anything on this list that other folks would like to talk about? So currently we have WASM UCAN 0.9 PR status, which I think is mergeable. UCAN chat server, like a dedicated UCAN chat rather than just a channel. IPVM, IPLI, UCANTO crossover, and Awake protocol. Anything else people want to chat about today?
I want to follow up, Brooklyn, on the call we had some time ago where we discussed the idea of moving own capabilities into their own.
I can't hear
what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
he's trying to refer to the my issue that we talked a bunch in a call, like separating the my into his own property.
Yeah, so if you take a look at so I made that change last night, which is part of why I think it's all good to merge. So changes that happened very recently for 0.9. My is no longer sorry, in this proposal. Maybe it's not the actual thing. For context for everybody else, Irakli, Hugo, and I got on a call about a month ago to talk about a few ideas and it's like, why is it like this, not like that? And they had some really interesting feedback or ideas on a few things. One of them was, instead of having this my idea, this ownership, this introduction as a URI scheme, what if we broke it out into its own field? And it's like, okay, sure. Like it from a purely semantic point of view, it's the same. Maybe it's easier to understand what's happening. So great. I went ahead and made that change. That makes the so to say, I'm going to redelegate everything from, so let's say I said all DNS records, including ones in the future, can be managed. And then later, we then want to say, well, as this user's DNS, right? That no longer works under this scheme, but part of that conversation as well was like, well, a lot of people aren't using that. It probably should be in the core spec at some stage, but it's unstable enough at this point that I just pulled it out, and we can still have it in implementations while we figure out what the right approach is. But it's not something that is like hard required today for everybody. So Fission uses it a lot, but we don't. It doesn't have to be required, right? And so it can still be in the implementation. We can still play around with it and figure out what the right way to go ahead with that is. I feel like that's probably the most controversial part of what I did yesterday, ripping that part out. So yeah, that's and then namespace. So we have UCAN : and then currently UCAN : and then like a content ID, and that got changed to UCAN : token so that we can reserve this UCAN namespace for lots of other things. So that's just adding an extra prefix. Chris.
I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on how you might capture this sentiment behind, well, this is a thing we might have formalized in the spec down the road. Yeah. Implementations might have it today, but it's not a required part of the spec, like maybe as some kind of a proposed extension or something that's captured in the repo somewhere.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So strategy that isn't done yet is to break this out into its own spec. And then if it if we find that it's useful and that it gets pretty solid, then we can merge it into the main spec, right? So I think as a strategy, this is a really good idea. Like, and we talked about this a little bit in, for those of you who are in Reykjavik week before last. You can write extensions. I literally can't stop you, even if I wanted to. I want you to. You can, yeah. In the same way that we're building on top of JWT, right? You can write extensions on top of UCAN. Whether or not everybody supports those or not is another question. But the really useful stuff will probably end up in the core spec if it's something that like everybody needs. But we're going to try to keep it like relatively small, I think, right?
So cookbook in the chat is kind of shorthand that Hugo and I came up with, which is a bunch of different things. But I think this is also Chris is an answer. So basically in the UCAN community website, in a repo, have a cookbook of ways that UCANs are being used. And that might also go all the way to like, organization X is doing something this way. So for instance, one of those things is that the DAG House team, Hugo, Rackley, and Michael, is DAG House the correct label that I can hang on you?
Yes.
Okay. Have gone for a implementation of UCAN. There very much includes servers. Fission's original constraints set the design as being like as peer-to-peer as possible. There's a bunch of things that are a lot easier. Well, or there are things that you can do differently when you have a server in the mix. And that is a useful cookbook pattern that we should, that I think that's one area where certainly from Fission, we haven't done a lot of work on defining and putting out stuff of like, here's how you use stuff if you want to have a server in the mix. That's an example of some cookbook stuff, best practices, stuff that's not yet in the spec. And ideally, that's something that we can all work on together and even use as a place to say, hey, have an idea that's not covered here, go to the cookbook session on the GitHub discussions and write up what you're trying to do. And we'd love to like riff on your idea. Does that make sense as a concept and rough next steps on cookbook?
Yeah. I was I think we also talked about like the capabilities, common capabilities that anyone can implement. I still think that should be more formal and should be more like an optional extension to the spec, but that's probably another conversation to be had.
Right, that's the other thing in scope. So, Brooke had basically mentioned, don't really want to get into something that looks like a registry quite yet, but can we start having a capability section of the cookbook where various people talk about how they use it? Yeah, capability marketplace. So to be very clear, and Michael, one of my things for you is, please, can we get your post in public somewhere so that we can share it with the UCAN community? I think that's very much in line with if you do a microservices style system, then you can have a capability marketplace where multiple different entities are using things and developers and other builders can compose across capabilities. Not ready to be hard-coded into any spec today, but at the very least, we should be sharing how we're doing it.
Yeah, so part of that discussion that came up was wanting to avoid having like an IANA registry that's a blocker for people defining their own capabilities, right? So having a set that are sort of like recommended or that people know that they can plug together, have like a standard library, amazing, or a cookbook of like patterns, amazing, but not writing them into the spec. Here are the capabilities you're allowed to use, right? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll respond to Boris's request real quick. Yeah, so that doc that I sent you was really a document like, hey, this is how we should be thinking about being a UCAN service provider. We've started building out a document that basically describes how we do engineering in DAG House. And that's going to actually be a public document when we're finished. So there will be something published, and it'll be much more like in practice, this is actually how you do it rather than just how to think about it. So that'll probably be a little bit more useful. I think one of the key things here, because you mentioned this early on, which is like when you're thinking as a service provider, there are different things that you can do. I think that is the naive way to think about it, and probably how we thought about it initially. And then the more that you dig into it, the more that you realize it's better to build the service as a distributed system that just looks like nodes in the same peer-to-peer network. And how do you do that? And what do you need to be thinking about there? And it all comes back to self-description, just like we're moving up the stack, I think, of self-description, where it's not just about sort of CIDs and the data structures inside of them, but all of the context that you build up about something between nodes inside of a service, you need to start like actually encoding into the protocols that talk to each other, and just surfacing those to users. So that's actually what we're working on. And yeah, we have many calls and docs that are being built over the next month or so. I plan on having that released before Cascadia JS. So just if you want a timeline for it, it should be released before.
Yeah. No timeline required there, but lovely to hear. Would love to get a recorded version of you riffing on this at some point. So maybe we'll do a special interview with Michael at some point.
You'll probably be able to just use the talk from Cascadia JS. So yeah.
Amazing. Okay. So actually on this topic, I was taking a few notes as we were going. Reserved capabilities. Another recommendation from Hugo during that previous call was it would be nice to split out, because we had reserved capabilities. And a lot of that was the entanglement between my and as with the kinds of things that they're allowed to do, like delegation. With those gone, then we were able to split them out. So the spec now has, or the proposed spec has reserved resources and reserved abilities. And it's always abilities, never actions at this point as well. So we standardized the terminology. Invocation, yeah. Amazing. So this is actually also on the agenda a little bit. I just wanted to mention, so there's some work happening in IPFS around calling convention and invocation for WASM and other things. And those will also need some auth mechanism as well. So we're probably going to look at stuff like this to pull in and standardize, along with FVM and some other sources as well. So definitely going to be digging into this more. And sort of the hope is that we can make this literally like whatever we end up calling it, IPLI or whatever the calling convention is, just make it the same, and then it'll just work everywhere. Should be amazing. May or may not work, but that's the current hope. So. Right. Also, Chris, you had your hand up about a minute or two ago. Was there something you wanted to jump in with?
I think I put my question in the chat, so
okay.
I think Philip answered.
Awesome. Chat server. So this has come up a couple times. Maybe Boris, just because you went like this, do you want to talk about this?
Tossing this to Hugo. Hugo's right, as per usual. So I think basically the background on this, Fission is slowly graduating a number of things into full community working groups, and it is probably appropriate timing. So rather than having a single channel in the Fission Discord server, to have a dedicated chat server for the UCAN community, we're we're growing. We have multiple things going on at the same time. People don't need to pay attention to everything all at once, and so a couple of channels and making sure that lots of people have control and can use that across multiple orgs. Hugo, do you have any preference? Would you like to start the bidding war on which chat system we use?
Not really. I may say that like not Discord, but that may be a hot take. I don't know. So I don't know. Whatever. It's hard to choose. It's like naming. It's gonna be a bike shed.
We don't need to cover a bunch of it here. I think that was my main point in saying it doesn't need to take up a bunch of time, is we don't need to bike shed on this call, but basically like, if you care, let's have a discussion. I would actually love to, like, can you say more on not Discord?
Yes, like we've had like some transitions in PL from different teams and different organizations, and to Discord, Slack, back to Discord, back to Slack. Like the whole Discord system of channels, you are in everything, and then you need to mute everything and then unmute the things you really care about. It's kind of troublesome. I never got used to it, but that may be just me. Not like
I really appreciate that. It's super useful. I think everybody's feeling this pain right now. I know the Fission team is, in the multiple things that we participate in. And so I would say, as a group, and this is not just UCAN, this is lots of other things, we need to design a multi-org system, and acknowledge that some of those other orgs will have their own patterns. For example, I know that the Fission team gets a ton of invites when another org which uses Slack wants to collaborate with us, and they have a pattern for doing that. But that doesn't really work in an open source. So I almost would say not Slack. And then we've just said not Discord and not Slack. And
how do people feel about PL's new shift to like bridging and like punting on the decision and just saying, well, you can be in a channel with whichever client? Like there's some downsides, like threading doesn't work across all the systems and kind of shows up a little bit weird. But yeah, I mean, if we have half the folks that are anything but Slack and the other half are anything but Discord, does that mean we're all pro Matrix, or like...
Do they already have like proper threads, not Discord threads? I don't know. That's a question.
Does Matrix? Recent versions of Matrix have threads, yeah.
Like not Discord threads. Like,
well, they're not Discord threads, but they're also not Slack threads. So
they're also not Slack threads, yeah.
That's one of the
Matrix threads.
Like, yeah, that's one of the other things with the Discord. The other day we had a thread or some thing to talk about this stuff, and today I was going, oh, I need to look something in there, and it was gone, and I couldn't find it again. So it's like ephemeral thing, and I would like to keep track of those.
Threads and Discords that auto archive, I consider to be a benefit because it means you don't spawn new channels. So that's probably enough bike shedding for now. I think we have to do a bridging strategy, and basically, who wants to work on this?
I can help. It would be cool if I'm not the only one, but yeah.
Yeah, and James, I'm going to tag you to help with infra.
Yeah, I already put my hand up. Okay.
Yes, Philip. Yeah, exactly.
UCAN powered chat. We'll just get that wrapped up next week, right?
UCAN threads.
Okay, that's it on Chat Shed 2022. Brooke.
Awake. I like that one. Let's talk about Awake. Is the spec written yet?
It is not. So the way I've been describing this, so I like obviously the past like 2-3 weeks, I've been pretty distracted, like flying to Iceland and, like all these things. So I haven't been doing much spec writing, but the way I've been describing this to people is I think Daniel and I had a reverse Spider-Man meme where, they're normally pointing at each other, but for us, it's like we've been pointing at ourselves and not really sure who's doing it. So what are your thoughts, Daniel? Who's actually doing this thing?
Is this specifically about like HTTP headers or what?
Awake, I think.
The Awake.
Oh,
protocol.
Awake, right. I don't know. I don't have a clear perspective on it. I don't know if I have enough details for the spec. I know that our implementation is not on spec at all at the moment. So I'm happy to contribute to it, but I would also probably need more clarity on the specifics of it.
So I think, Hugo, are you guys still planning to install to implement web crypto API powered DIDs?
Yes.
So you will also need Awake.
Yes.
Punt and do a separate session on that, Brooke?
Philip?
Daniel, what do you mean by not spec compliant and your implementation? Because right now there is no spec, right?
Well, there's a rough spec in our white paper, which isn't really a white paper. So what are words?
But then,
yes, I mean, I'm following the rough spec in the white paper. I'm doing broad strokes, what you're supposed to do with Awake. But I have all of my own custom messages with message types and yada, yada, yada on it. And so if I were to talk to somebody else's Awake protocol, they would not be able to understand each other.
I think there might be value in reevaluating some stuff there. For example, I know that we're using Awake mostly to like link devices, but maybe sometimes you want to use Awake to delegate subrights to someone else. And I don't think, I don't know, maybe the spec already covers all of those things. I don't know. So I'm just thinking, is it
we
too
primarily
bad?
use it to we primarily use it to link devices as well. I guess the one special case of that, which we have not made yet, but may be interested in the future, is I want to log in on this specific app on a new device, and I don't want to link the entire device with an auth lobby and everything. I just need one session in this application. And so, but that still matches the Awake spec. There's nothing in there that says that you can't do that.
Is your worry, sorry, go ahead.
Put a bound around it. Awake is essentially mutual TLS, but with UCANs, so that you actually know what the other party can talk with. So it's actually not about linking at all.
Yeah.
Right. It's just how to create a secure, bootstrap up a secure connection where you know something about the other party. And then you can transfer credentials or do some other, you could use it to set up secure chat, for example, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry. Back to you.
When you're saying it's not spec compliant, you're saying if you were to use this implementation to link at the existing fission auth lobby, then that would fail.
Yeah, they would not be able to talk with each other. One reason is that we use a different transport. We use a WebSockets relay instead of WebRTC, and
so do we, by the way.
We do too. Yeah.
Oh, you do? Oh, I thought it was WebRTC and then linking with like a WebRTC star.
We used to have that, but WebRTC star has multiple downsides. So as there gets to be better WebRTC signaling, so there's some stuff coming out of the Matrix community in the next couple months. Maybe we can go back to that, but it's also like the spec should be written transport agnostic.
Yeah, agreed. And then there's just, there's nothing in the white paper about an exact description of what these messages look like what the headers on them are, how exactly the data is laid out in them. And so I believe I have all of the same data, but it's probably laid out in a different format. So these would not be able to understand each other.
Should we strive for having it work against existing code? Should the first version of the spec be or like describe exactly the encoding that we're using at Fission today?
So there's a couple things, right? One, there's a corner case in the existing flow where you get blocked on the first connection. And so we need to change one order of messages. There's not even the order who sends the message. Needs to switch. So there needs to be a change to the spec regardless. The actual format of the messages, I don't think it really matters that much. I would love to see Blue Sky's implementation, and then we can see like maybe there's good ideas in there, right? So it doesn't have to be just Fission's version. So sticking with rough consensus and running code, we have 2 sets of running code. That's amazing. So let's see how different they are, and maybe there's something that we want to take from one and the other, and have some like beautiful Frankenstein come out the other side.
Yeah, that sounds good. I posted a link to it. It's all in our public repo. And if we want to on a different call, we can dive into the details on that.
Do we have a discussion for this yet? Probably, right? GitHub discussion or something where we can talk more? No.
So there's a repo that's just a skeleton with like the IP release and stuff. We should just do it directly there, I think. So issues and discussions and whatnot, right on the repo probably makes sense. Boris.
I think so. Just tying in what I asked about Hugo, if they're going to do Web Crypto API, Hugo had an initial call with Jeff. Fission and Daghouse are going to attempt to interop. So that's an area as well, right? That's less of a priority for Blue Sky, which I totally understand, but it's one of those things where we could look at even consuming Blue Sky DIDs or other things like that down the line in a similar fashion, right? We need to have at least, like, as well as multiple code implementations, we have to have a couple of entities attempting interop. And I think that's on Daghouse Fission roadmap for sure. So heading in the right direction.
Yeah, and hopefully it's also with the Blue Sky, because I think one of the things they already have there is like the registry they use. Not totally I didn't go too deep into the code and how it works, but I think the registry would make sense for interop, where we have somewhere where we register like our DIDs and whatnot, so we can resolve them and discover them in some way.
Yeah, maybe super useful to just talk about this very briefly. So, UCAN ultimately sits on top of DIDs or uses DIDs as a baseline. I know this came up talking to Chris as well. Fission is working on wallet auth, which is basically getting a DID out of any blockchain account that can be then used with UCANs and slash sign in with Ethereum that wants to work with UCAN in different ways. And Chris Joel, mentioned passkeys. We have a thread on it in the discussions. So the way that I think about it, Web Crypto API has actually worked really well for Fission in the sense that it's been the most stable part of our system in all this new stuff that we're doing. Daniel, there's a whole other discussion there that I'd love to we should riff at some point. It's super interesting. But it's essentially us going, hopefully people will trust us in this new wacky way of doing things. Blockchain accounts and the DIDs that come out of them are 50 million accounts. If we integrate passkey, which I think is a good idea and is an upcoming pattern, that's 1 billion accounts in 6 months. So we should work on passkey.
I would absolutely love passkey. Also, a maybe relevant thing sort of in this domain is that we're talking with Magic Link right now about hopefully getting native UCAN support in their iframe.
Cool.
The jury's still out on exactly what this is going to look like, but they seem pretty interested in helping provide it with their JSON RPC API.
Yeah, I mean,
and we didn't lead with this because
yeah, right.
Yeah, great. So
I have one,
am I
one more
capturing a
thing.
to-do that says, I'm capturing a to-do that says passkey discussion, awake discussion. Anything else I should be scribing?
Yeah. So I think we also mentioned this before. The way, or spec out a way, or describe a way to request capabilities. Like one example is how OAuth works. They have like a URL query string type of thing where they just serialize it that way. We should have something like it. And
We should look at GNAP as prior out there in IETF. They're sort of working on a capability requesting protocol. It's former OAuth people too.
And is the expectation that Fido is going to have some updates to it where you can encode capabilities in there? Because my understanding is that right now you'd have to do some really hacky workaround to get them in there.
We're currently at hacky workaround, yes.
Okay.
So
hey,
part
hacky
of-
workarounds work. So.
Yeah. So part of the idea basically is if we're already exploring how to bring non-UCAN stuff into a UCAN world with, oh my God, what's it called?
SUI?
Yeah, SUI. Then could we do the same thing with Fido? And we haven't looked at it like super in depth. I've got the spec open. I've read maybe, I don't know, about a third of it. And there is like, I mean, you probably remember from back in the day where it was like, well, could we then like set up a service worker in the browser and then like bounce a credential off of it and like all of this stuff? But it's like, we're still at like, get it working at all.
Right.
Because if we have passkeys, then, you know, Apple, Google, and Microsoft are doing the key recovery portions and key management bit for us, which would be pretty great. Yeah, so it's just making things easier, right? As much as possible. Yeah.
Bengo, you mentioned GNAP, I think. So I looked it up, Grant Negotiation and Authorization Protocol. Is there, it seems like a negotiation protocol for the capabilities you want to request. So far, I've been thinking about what Hugo mentioned as you just request a set of capabilities. And if your receiver like just answers you with the subset of capabilities that it allows you to have, is there something else to be learned from GNAP that can be shortly, I don't know, summarized?
Not yet. I would kind of need to study it more myself. It's just something I've heard described as like some people are using as a way of requesting capabilities. And then the other thing I linked to after that is, you know, a completely other one that's also worth looking at just as a protocol and process to request capabilities. The second link I think is more illustrative of, I don't know, it kind of looks cool. I think a cool way of saying, hey, I need capabilities to do this or that. But
all right, thanks.
It's not for UCANs, it's for Zcans.
Cool.
I'll read more about GNAP.
Yeah, something that we'd talked about a long time ago, basically, was because capabilities are, you know, can essentially not necessarily like self-described, but they're declarative, and so you could essentially send like, hey, these are the things I would like to see back in a payload, and then you get them back or you don't, essentially. Dimitri?
Hi. Yeah. So on an unrelated topic, I was wondering, what are the chances that we could, that this would be willing to find another time slot, just because it's opposite. It's at the same time as the distributed web node, which I think is UCAN adjacent, and the encrypted data vaults. I was wondering if there's any possibility that we could move this call up or down an hour or some other time.
So Dimitri, that's great. Can you actually share the details on the distributed web node stuff on those timing? That would be super awesome. Just a chat or a follow up. In general, discussions that we've had is how to go around the clock for time zones. So as well. So we've got a bunch of these things. Let's do a follow up on that on always the same day, always the same time is rough for across things. So TBD, we can rotate a little. Thank you for bringing it up.
Okay, so that's actually that makes sense. That's really helpful because, for example, the distributed web node is every other week at this time. So they already rotate, and so like it might be if UCAN group is interested in rotating for time zone reasons, that might be really convenient too.
We'll figure it out. I think right now we're doing one community call per month, and we've basically spawned at least 2 other talks that have to happen for special purpose things. So good to be mindful of.
Got it. Thank you.
If anyone has a proposal to fix time zones, that would also be really helpful.
I think we're gonna at least get rid of leap seconds, right? So I don't know. That's a bonus.
Where are we at on the list, Brooke?
All right. So we've talked about 0.9 PR, Hugo and or Rackley. If you could just give the latest changes a look and the thumbs up, thumbs down. I'd love to get this thing merged at some stage. UCAN chat server, invocation model, which is, I think, like some of the furthest along from the IPLI stuff. Awake, so that's all covered, great. Common caps, I think it sounds like that's going to mainly happen in a cookbook.
Yeah.
And leaves one final thing in here, which is WASM UCAN. So this is a general pattern that we're seeing of, well, what if we, instead of splitting ourselves over n different languages and n different implementations, we can still encourage there to be a bunch of different implementations, but it would be really helpful to get people running with something really portable just to get started, and then doing wrappers around them, and then people can go and write, if they really want a version in Ruby, they can write a top to bottom Ruby implementation, but to get started, they could use Rust and WASM inside, and then just write bindings. So my understanding is that the existing RS UCAN library is written in a very portable way, that we could also compile that down to WASM and do browser bindings, and then use the Rust, like the native Rust, for servers and desktops and everywhere else. Chris, I realize I didn't ask you to prepare anything ahead of time, but do you want to talk a little bit about how feasible that would be? And I'd love to get people to weigh in on how they would feel about swapping out the internals of this.
Yeah, and your discussion thread did catch my attention, so I put a reply up there that anyone else might be who's interested may want to read. But the gist of my sort of not super rigorously studied opinion is that this is probably going to be great if somebody else wants to write a web targeting application in Rust. I mean, if you're going to use the Rust implementation as the base of your WASM version. But it's a little bit more of a balancing act for anyone else who's perhaps developing a JavaScript based front end. Because you sort of pay an outsized price if you're not sort of deduplicating dependencies across the rest of your application. You're not really fitting in ergonomically with the JavaScript tooling ecosystem, at least not yet. I mean, I imagine in time, all of these tools will start to recognize that WASM needs to be optimized just like everything else. But yeah, I mean, there's sort of a nice, the engineer in me really appreciates the idea that we could have a common code base and deploy it everywhere. And certainly in our application, we're taking advantage of that. But we're also primarily writing everything in Rust and not doing a whole lot of JavaScript. So it's an easier choice for us to make. Yeah, so everything you proposed about it, I think sounds really good and totally plausible. And we're definitely designing RSUCAN to be compatible with the web. And we run tests in both a browser and natively.
If I could add to that. So, and again, same disclaimer, this could just be anecdotal and not enough data. But the other Rust to WASM implementations in this space, so for example, Security has encrypted data vault client implementation where they compile the WASM and run on the web. The ones I've seen have severe optimization penalties in the sense of it's single-threaded. It doesn't have the same ease with promises with async await with like state management that native JavaScript has in the browser. So it tends to be really slow, right? In addition to paying for the space optimization costs that you just mentioned. So like I totally agree with you. The engineering dream of write once, run everywhere is amazing. And as Brooke said, it could be just that this is the starting point. But I do think in general, a JavaScript library in addition would be really helpful for people.
Chris?
Yeah, I just add, I think there's strategies to, for instance, overcome single-threadedness. Like you could have your JavaScript wrapper manage a worker that's running the WASM bundle. And so, but then that sort of comes with like the downside of now you have a heavier wrapper layer in JavaScript around the underlying implementation. It also comes with the downside of a lot of tools out there still don't really recognize web workers as like a part of the JavaScript application front end. And so like trying to shoehorn support workers into the tooling is a whole pain in the butt. And that can complicate deployment for people if they try to use it. So unfortunately, I think a lot of, when you try to like hybridize between WASM and JavaScript, you sort of hit this wall of the ecosystem just isn't really ready for you to have an optimal experience doing that.
Yeah. I think this is, let's put it this way. This is intent to implement from Fission. This is, Chris saying, sure, happy to work with you with RSUCAN, probably to like actually get it deployment and working and everything. There will be a, UCAN WASM repo that may consume RSUCAN, or, I'll leave you guys up to the right way to do some of that engineering. We're exploring this across a number of different fronts. We've come up with various areas where like, oh, to make worker stuff work, you need to base 64 encode it and put it somewhere, or to make WASM work, you need to base 64 and put it somewhere. And we're like, we have this whole like content addressing platform that might be super useful for this, but like the work to be done is to directly put it in a workflow of front-end engineers so that it can be consumed. Never mind the building it part. So like we totally acknowledge that is work to be done. Our current gut instinct is that WASM is going to be at an inflection point, and we need to balance how much time we spend fighting the worker wars, WASM wars, and bundler wars, right? So to be clear, we literally already have this problem with TS UCAN. We're just fighting slightly different battles.
Chris?
If it's of interest, in another life, I actually tackled this exact problem for a different domain where we had a 3D renderer that needed to take advantage of a WASM plugin compiled from C++ that we couldn't ship with the JavaScript itself. And so we had a strategy where we leveraged a CDN and had the WASM blob stored in the CDN as like a default. And then for consumers, they can configure an alternate location for it so that you can kind of like have a balance between, you know, all of the constraints of how do I fit this into my build pipeline and how do I make sure I get it from a reliable place and how do I make sure I can put it on my corporate CDN if I need to do that, etc.
For what it's worth, that's exactly where I landed with RS WinFS today. So
The crabs are coming for everyone. Actually, for that matter, Chris, you have an outstanding to-do, which is if you can hop into the discussion thread and let's get you an RS UCAN mascot. So for those that don't know, if you make an implementation, we're happy to, Vision's happy to deploy our illustrator that we work with to make a fun app mascot for your repo. I feel like Hugo, you know, you just keep coming with some of your puns. We need to illustrate some more of those puns at some point too.
Which actually maybe also comes back to, you know, places to put this stuff and where to communicate, right? So we've been using GitHub discussions. We're now talking about some like more real-time comms. How are people feeling about GitHub discussions versus some other tools? I'm going to try not bias people here. So.
I personally like GitHub discussions just for an improvement over GitHub issues in the like maybe not how they work exactly, but that they're named discussions and not issues, and that they're attached to the repo. Yeah.
It's firmly in like the good enough category where other things might be 5 to 10% better, and that seems to not be worth having it outside of GitHub. So
notifications in the same spot are also really nice.
I'm an outlier where like all of my notifications are bankrupt, so like you just can't get a hold of me via anything. But I won't let that drive me.
You just have to do a mass purge of GitHub notifications every month so that they're useful for the next like 3 weeks.
No, even the email inbox that they land in is also bankrupt. Like it's cascading failures.
So do you always also get this? Are you overwhelmed with your GitHub notifications? Do you want to try to manage them or something? Message.
Yeah, except it's literally like DMs from PMs at GitHub saying, "Do you want to try this new thing?"
Awesome. So GitHub discussions working for people. It's fantastic. For things like, hey, I would like to have a logo made, things like that. So we're going to stick that in the discussions in the spec repo, I guess. This seems to be like the home for stuff. So let's just like draw a line in the sand and say this is the official home for the high-level project as opposed to individual specs, right? So we'll leave everything here, including community stuff. And then if you need to have a discussion about, say, Awake specifically, then you can go and do that in the Awake repo.
Yeah, maybe that's just more useful to do is say like, for now, we're literally only going to have a single GitHub discussion. It will live in the spec repo. Good God, if you need to talk about Awake, sweet, we can make a new GitHub discussions category if you really want a category, but let's just use this as a discussion for kind of anything in the repo for now, and we'll see how things evolve.
Awesome. Any other items, discussion points, thoughts, feelings people want to cover in the last 8 minutes we have here scheduled, or should I give you all a few minutes back?
Captured notes. I will basically just flag, and we'll figure out more how to do this with follow-ups and everything else like that. I've got names to a couple of things just so that people know. It's up to you to figure out how to follow up on that. CASA, Chain Agnostic Standards Alliance, September 15th in Berlin. I need to figure out how and where we indicate that UCAN people are meeting, but that will be definitely a meeting. Also floated West Coast UCAN users, because Chris is like, I can't fucking take off to Europe again. There's a couple of other projects that are interested in that. And yes, as Michael mentioned, Cascadia JS is going to have some UCAN people at it. So some of these things are just like community website discussions. We'll use discussion threads generally as the default for all of these things, for like, here's a link to find out more. Yeah, looking forward to momentum, lots more people implementing stuff. Let's go, in the vernacular of our times.
So also a bunch of us will be at DWeb Camp. I'm pretty sure Dimitri will be there. Michael Rogers will be there. I think Michael said Irakli might be there.
Amazing.
We're going to have a couple people from Blue Sky there as well. I'm going to be there.
Amazing. So ideally, this is the kind of thing that we have like PR to the community website is the outcome, where you just have like a super simple list of things. I think there's probably a bunch of other things on the community website where, you know, if any of the teams / projects / apps want to indicate that they're doing UCAN stuff, we'll have a section where people PR in their logos and stuff like that, right? And so that generally a joint thing that it's there. And it's on all of us to kind of like make our home nicer.
Brent.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
We can hear you.
I'll just assume that. So in terms of UCANs, if I have like two devices kind of communicating pairwise, so they're not technically doing outside service, I would need to send the entire UCAN over the wire, or if it already had it cached, I'd have to have a hash of it. Is that correct?
So every time that you invoke a UCAN, you need a new UCAN. So you can set up, there's a, I think in the implementer's suggestions section, at least on the 0.9 PR, there's a recommendation on how to do, okay, I'm going to trust this session and not create a new UCAN every time. But if you want to have high security, then you need to have a unique UCAN for every invocation.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look into that more, I guess, because yeah, respect people's time.
Well, from a protocol perspective, that's not technically true, because you could hand around that UCAN to a bunch of different people and they could all decide to invoke it, right? Like theoretically, it's just that the only way that in a distributed system that you would have to like post a response to that UCAN would be the hash of that UCAN. So, you know, there's like a fan out that could occur, but they're all going to kind of come back to one place, right? From the point of view of UCAN, you don't have, if you assume that there's a transport like HTTP where you're going to get one response, right? Then that's not necessarily true for the UCAN, right?
Yeah. Well, so the concern for the single use is to prevent the token getting stolen and reused. So like you can allow that and you can weaken that constraint, which is why it's a recommendation, not like a hard requirement in the spec. Yeah. So, again, it depends on the exact use case, right? So like going up to some session and then using the hash as like a session token is totally a thing, right? So it's very, very lightweight and totally works. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like something that we should probably call out in the spec is that the hash of the UCAN, the invocation, and all the UCANs really is like kind of a privacy context, right? Because it's not necessarily guessable. But if you let it leak, then other people might be able to like listen to events on it, right? And things that happen to it in the network. So you do want to kind of keep that address to yourself a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Brent's hands up. Do you have another question, Brent?
I'm sorry. Yeah. So you said that you keep having to send UCANs over the wire. Okay. I will have to play with it to see how it works, but I may not work with this necessarily, but one of the devices one of the protocols I'm working with is LoRa, and it's pretty lightweight. So is that JSON blob going to be a problem per se, or maybe I should ask it like how small can these payloads be and still work?
So yeah, so it depends. If you've seen a UCAN before, you can reference it by its hash. So it's whatever, 30 to 50 characters, depending on how you've encoded the hash. And if you're using it as like the full encoded JWT, it's about the size of the JWT with a signature. So the signature is usually the big part. So especially using, say, RSA, that's like at least half the size of the payload, if not more. If as they get more nested, and if you're sending everything over in that first request, that first one can be relatively large, but on the order of, say, a couple kilobytes. But then because it's content addressed, you can get space savings from referring to it by the hash after, and all the internal ones as well.
I can say that a single layer of a UCAN can be as small as 380, 90 bytes or something if you're using ED25519. So a different kind of signature algorithm than RSA. We're restricted to RSA in the browser because that's what the Web Crypto API supports. But outside the browser, UCANs can be fairly small. And then usually if you have, like, as Brooke said, if you have like recurring requests all the time and you want to have high security and send a new UCAN, you can compress the parts that are like common to every request as a SID, and so you end up with like 400 bytes every time.
You still need to know about the payload for those CIDs. So those need to go over the wires at some point.
Like at least once. Yeah. Awesome. So we're at exactly time. And any other questions? Awesome. Great. Well, if anybody does think of anything, you know where to put it. We just discussed it in the discussions. Amazing. And aside from that, I'll see you all at the next one in about a month.